Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are joining us from today. On behalf of the Foundation for IT Sustainability, we would like to welcome you to International Green IT Awareness Week for 2012. Thank you for joining us for this very special live presentation. We're really glad you could join us today. My name is Tim Martin, a project manager with the Foundation for IT Sustainability, and I'm going to give a quick overview of today's session and also walk through some housekeeping items. Then I'll turn it over to our featured presenter, Carol Baroudi, who will introduce herself and her topic and start the presentation. As you may know, International Green IT Awareness Week was founded and is sponsored by the Foundation for IT Sustainability, which is a global non-profit organization. Our mission is to reduce the negative impacts of technology on the environment, as well as promote the sustainable use of technology to help solve environmental problems. We do this in a number of ways, by educating individuals, corporations and government, promoting the implementation of green IT best practices, as well as encouraging the development of a more sustainable technology alternative. If you haven't heard of us before, please do visit us on the web at www.fits.org. As I mentioned earlier, today we have a very special guest, Carol Baroudi, author of Green IT for Dummies, joining us to present her topic entitled Electronics' Dirty Little Secrets and How to Move from Green IT to Sustainable IT. Carol will present her material, a copy of which is available right now in PDF format on this session's registration page, and then we will take some questions from the audience. We'd ask that if you do have any questions for Carol throughout the presentation, please submit them in the question panel on the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen, and we shall answer your questions at the end of the session. With that, I'm happy to introduce Carol, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to her now to introduce herself and commence her presentation.
Thank you so much, Tim. Are we good?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's great to be here, and I'm very excited to be talking to such a diverse audience, and I hope you can bear with my American accent. I've become a real zealot around sustainability and green IT in particular, in part because I've been around IT for more than 40 years. And for the most of those 40 years, I never gave it a second thought. I am the practice advisor for sustainability for a company called Redemtech. And I'll tell you more about Redemtech as we go along because, in fact, Redemtech was a company I discovered when I was researching green IT for dummies. And, in fact, when I got to the chapter called E-Waste, or E-Waste Not, E-Want Not, I found that Redemtech had actually set the best standards, the best practices for handling electronic waste. And it's core to my thinking and my delivery here because green IT is exactly how Redemtech has been operating for more than 14 years. The idea is to make what IT we have last so that we're not cycling through it dramatically. We've got to have the best new thing at every moment kind of psychology. Whenever I start to write a book, I know that I can't do it by myself. I've been writing for Dummies books since 1993. My first was the first edition of The Internet for Dummies, which came out in 1993. So by now you'd think I'd be a pretty good dummy. But in this case, I drew upon people with very strong skills in electronics and who've also been in IT for decades, like myself, particularly Jeff Hill and Arnold Reinhold, have been key in delivering the content of Green IT for Dummies. In the course of my IT career, I've been an industry analyst, which means that I've had the wonderful opportunity to see many emerging technologies come in and go, and sustainability has now got my full attention. I say, why are we here today? Because I think, unlike any other technology movement I've seen in the course of my career, sustainability has to take more on, each of us has to take on more and more. It's not just about IT, but if we don't put IT in the larger context of sustainability, it's kind of moot. You know, we really have to see the bigger picture that there's so much at risk. and that IT is a very practical way to address some of the aspects of our very endangered planet. And I'm a firm believer in the idea that sustainability must address a triple bottom line, namely that if we can't maintain ourselves, then we won't be able to do much good. If we're not taking care of the people along the way, then what we're doing should not be doing. So those of you who really don't know the triple bottom line, I'd suggest you start your sustainability career by reading about the triple bottom line, and if you have questions, I'm happy to take them at the end. Now, I take as a point of departure a slightly different point from the simple idea that IT is consuming vast amounts of energy all the time. That is the case. IT is consuming vast amounts of energy all the time. And in a world where we think that everything has to be on all the time, we're just creating a gap in what we need in terms of energy and our expenditure of it. When we think about energy, we really often don't think of its source. We flip a switch and things go on, but we're not seeing what it took to get that energy to power that device. We'll talk about that in a minute. So when we think about energy, I want you to understand that actually the greatest amount of energy associated with these little devices that we're talking about, and the big ones, whether they're servers or iPods, from the biggest to the largest, the most amount of energy associated with each device is actually expended in its manufacture. Before it ever gets to you, enormous amount of energy has been expended. So I'm proposing this concept of a return on energy expenditure, REE. Okay, I made that up. You're not going to find it in the research, but I think that to get the best return on energy expenditure means that we're practicing a kind of efficiency that we have to see in the longer term. It's not just the efficiency of the device in the moment, but the efficiency of what we're doing with the energy that we're expending on a day-to-day basis. Now, I think there are things that we can do, and these are kinds of hot topics, and I think that if you're not aware of them, you need to be aware of them. There are many manufacturers who intentionally keep their IT products out of the secondary market. What's the secondary market? Can I buy this equipment used? I know that here in the United States, we, Redentech, try to make IT last. We try to make everything available on the secondary market because there are people and organizations that can't keep buying new. Schools, for example, can't afford the price of churning their electronics every 2 years. So there's a lot of usable life in many electronics that are taken off the market by manufacturers who want you to simply buy new, and I think it's time that we push back on those manufacturers. We can't believe that we have all the resources we'll need to simply continue to create new product for everyone who wants it. The emerging markets in Asia alone can chew up the amount of natural resources that are being developed. For example, rare earth elements, which are critical, and we'll talk about those. They're critical to how these devices work. They're being mined only in China right now. And if we turn on that tap and say all we have to do is just make more, we're literally going to run out of the critical resources. So here I want you to really think about that device that's in front of you. We're all looking at them, we're staring at them, we've got our fingers on the mouse and we're staring at the screen. But few of us stop to think how that device came to be, what constitutes the critical little tiny components that are barely visible to our eye, who put them together, and how did they arrive at our local store or delivered by our organization or however we happen to inherit them. So today I want to make sure that you know a little bit more about that device and these devices and their history. Now, for those of you who are older, the initial CRT will remind you of the cathode ray tube, which was those big, chunky monitors that many of us lived with for decades. And now Those of you join flat screen don't necessarily have the association with CRT, but I'm going to give you a new association with CRT. C stands for conflict minerals, R stands for rare earth elements, and T for toxic compounds. That's what's in our devices. The conflict minerals are tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. Now, they are not only sourced in the Democratic Republic of China, the DRC, but when they contribute to a society that is known to be one of the most dangerous places on the earth for women and children. This is a society where rape and murder are used as processes of intimidation, and children are performing the labor. So there is actual legislation in the United States and other parts of the world to look at transparency in the supply chain. Where are the tin, the tantalum, the tungsten, and gold coming from, in an attempt to unplug this horrible society from gaining from the terror that's being inflicted on its society. So these are the conflict minerals. So when we talk about the CRT, these are the C. Now, I can't even pronounce these rare earth elements. They're not the kind of thing we think about in our daily comings and goings. Cerium, yttrium, erbium, holmium. But if you look at the list on the right, these are things whether we know about them, they affect our daily lives, whether they are lasers that are used in surgery, lasers that are used in manufacturing, all kinds of medical devices, the things that make our cell phones vibrate, self-cleaning ovens. I don't know about you, I don't have one of those, but all these things on the right are actually in common manufacture and well used in the developed nations. They are predicated on the availability of rare earth elements. Now, what you need to know about rare earth elements is not that they are so very rare, because in fact in the Earth's core they're rather plentiful, but they are extremely expensive and dirty and dangerous to mine. So expensive and dirty that mining in the United States for these elements was abandoned some time ago. And right now on the Earth, the only place they're being mined is China. Sorry, I have a little click with my little clicker here. So when you think about where they're being sourced, right now they're only being sourced in China, and we know that Asia has its own growing market for these devices. So it's very conceivable, and in fact likely, that the demand for these elements will outstrip the rate of production. Right now in the world, there's not really adequate ways to reclaim them in the recycling processes. Japan is doing research on how to reclaim these rare earth elements from our electronic devices. But right now, with the more devices we consume, the more rare earth elements we are consuming, and they're not really reclaimable yet. So if you kind of see the proliferation of devices, and I certainly have witnessed it in my lifetime. In 1993, when I did the Internet for Dummies for the first time, it was not standard for a home to have a PC. Some of us geeks did if we were fortunate enough to work for a high-tech company. But this whole proliferation of the PC in the home, and then all these electronic devices, from the iPod to the iPad to smartphones, this has all happened in a relatively quick period of time. And part and parcel of that is the problem is that they've been proliferated without any infrastructure for reclamation. We aren't reclaiming these devices. We're not actually getting back the kinds of raw materials that we need for the most part. So when we're just churning with the next new thing, we are rapidly diminishing the supply of rare earth elements. Now, T is for toxic. And this is why it's so important that your device doesn't end up in a landfill or doesn't end up incinerated or doesn't end up in the hands of people who aren't protected with proper equipment and protections to actually process these things. And you know, these are what's in the things that we're talking about every day. And you think about how clean they often look, and they are deceptively toxic inside. So I ask you each, where are your electronics going when you don't want them anymore? What do you do with them? Now, some parts of the globe are certainly ahead of the United States. When there's a requirement for retailers and manufacturers to take the devices back at end of life, that's a really excellent step, but it's not codified in all of the world yet. Now, these are stats from the United States. According to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, in 2009, less than 20% of the more than 3 million tons of electronic waste was recycled. So that means that more than 80% were going into landfill, poisoning the water, poisoning the earth, or incinerated. You know, think about what was in that last slide about what is actually going into the air when these things are burned. And then of that less than 20%, 50 to 80% of that was exported from the United States. And the United States is not the only guilty party here. There's a lot of e-waste coming from Europe, and we'll see where it's landing. Here's where it's landing in Guiyu, China, known as one of the most toxic places on the planet, highest miscarriage rate in the world. It's landing in Nigeria. These slides are coming from the Basel Action Network. You can check them out at www.ban.org. The Basel Action Network has been in place to try to enforce the Basel Action Convention, a law, an international law that was codified by 169 countries in 1989. So most of the developed world believes that this should not happen, yet it's increasing, not decreasing in problem. People are trying to reclaim the precious metals. This is an acid bath. Here, clearly this worker doesn't have much in the way of protection, so she's inhaling the fumes from the acid bath. This is our junk. Often the electronic trash is burned in an attempt to strip away everything but the precious metals. That means that all the plastics are being burned. There are a couple of documentaries available. If you can't find them, there's some on at the BAN website, and I can get you pointers to the ones from 60 Minutes or Frontline that show exactly how electronics go from what looks like a friendly recycling event and end up in places like this. Now, that's where we don't want them to go. We have alternatives, and that's why Redentech does business the way it does. You can make your electronics, you use electronics, go someplace completely usable by other people, and certainly reclaimable for those elements that are reclaimed, everything from the plastic to the precious metals. Those things should be reclaimed. There's no reason they should be going to a landfill or incinerated. So when we take a point of view of sustainability, extending the life of the device, I believe, is the most sustainable action. And that goes back to that return on energy expenditure. Often equipment can be refurbished, upgraded, and redeployed within an organization. It can be sold, and other organizations can use it. There's an organization in the U.S. called TechSoup, and TechSoup sells refurbished equipment to nonprofits, making good, warranted, usable, serviceable equipment available at a price that a nonprofit can afford. And you can donate. Now, there's a lot of ways to donate here in the U.S. Redemtech has been a partner with Habitat for Humanity for several years, and now is partnering with the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, to address the digital divide. That means that people who can't afford computers can suddenly afford computers and high-speed internet access. We'll talk more in a minute. So when we're thinking, I know we have kind of a mix here in this audience of whether it's you at home with your own computer or you in your job where there are 10 or 50 or 1,000 or 5,000 or 25,000 computers. But think about what the life of your assets are, because in fact nothing should be going in the trash. Absolutely nothing should go in the trash. Promise me, after this slide, you will never throw your electronics in the trash again. They can go to help other people, and they can, if worst case, they can be recycled, but in the recycling they have to use an e-Stewards recycler so that you know that both the workers and the assets are protected. You don't want any export of non-functional equipment. If you reuse a computer as opposed to throwing it into the recycling stream, you have energy savings because we're extending the life of the asset. We're keeping emissions down because nothing is being incinerated, and there will be no landfill. I mentioned a minute ago the e-Stewards standard. It's the only international standard for dealing with electronic waste. It's a standard that was developed over many years in a collaboration between private sector, nonprofits, NGOs, to really codify the best practices around electronics handling. Much of what you see in the e-Stewards standard has been adopted in the National Strategy for Electronic Stewardship that the U.S. EPA produced last year. For the very first time, a mandate has come out from the General Services Administration for the U.S. federal government that they must use a certified recycler. And this is a huge deal because I think part of the problem I know in the United States, and I suspect globally, is that we don't know where all the electronic assets are. I think many of them are sitting in people's closets because they know they shouldn't be throwing them away and they're not being used. So we have a lot of electronics that need to be put back into service in one way, shape, or form. So e-Stewards has third-party auditing and training of the auditors, and every aspect of an e-Stewards recycling has to be e-Stewards certified. So, for example, Redemtech, which does a lot of refurbishment, redeploying, remarketing of used equipment, has downstream recycling partners. We send our leaded glass from the CRT to the lead smelter. Anything that's got mercury in it, we send to a mercury processor because we don't want the mercury contaminating other things. Plastics goes to the plastics handler. But all of our downstream partners have to be e-Stewards certified. We have to look at those each individually and make sure that the e-Stewards processing is enforced in every place. We use no prison labor, and I say that this is, people say, what do you mean prison labor? Well, in the United States and in other places, prison labor is used to recapture the precious metals without adequate worker protection. So this is a very important component of the e-Stewards standard. And no export of non-functioning equipment. There are those who would like to tell you that you're doing people a favor by shipping our junk to them, and you've just seen the slides. That's not doing anybody any favor. From an e-Stewards recycler, you will get mass balance accounting. You get what comes in and goes out in its exact quantities. So you can all add it up at the end, and know that what you sent in has come out in reusable feedstock for a new manufacturing process. Second, I just want to mention that Serious Good program that I was talking about before. This is Connect to Compete. This is in the U.S. currently, but we can facilitate donations in other parts of the world. We have processing in Canada, Mexico, the UK, which is servicing Europe, and we're soon to be opening in Singapore for the Asian market. So we can facilitate a donation so that the donation itself is a usable, workable computer. It comes equipped with new Microsoft Office or Home Office and a Word package, so that these are machines that are known to be working. They come with tech support. They come with, in the case of the Connect to Compete program, digital literacy training. And at the end, we, Redemtech, take them back so that we know that they'll be processed appropriately at their end of life. Now, this little connected dots slide I inserted a few weeks ago when May 5th came. It has to do with, May 5th had to do with connecting the dots around climate change, and if you could see the world as a whole and see how many places are being affected, it becomes much more clear that there's a problem. And if you only take isolated incidences and isolated environments and isolated geographies and we put them all together, you start to see the pattern is much more drastic than is easily seen on a day-by-day basis. Well, it's my feeling that connecting the dots is not just about connecting about climate change, it's connecting the dots between turning that switch on, that electrical switch on, and how that's impacting the climate, because we don't really necessarily see the consequences of our actions. We turn things on and we're sort of cut off from their consequences. So I think the part of our problem is we don't understand that everything that we do electronically we're paying for with energy, whether it's a Google search, a Facebook upload. These are the Facebook and Google data centers. I want you to really start to envision the electricity that's being used for us to enjoy social media, for us to have this communications. These are not free. We can be a lot more intelligent about them, but we need to do something about our use as IT consumers and the sourcing of our electricity to continue our habit, if that's what we're going to do. When we turn on the switch, are we seeing that behind that switch is some sort of electrical plant, whether it's coal, nuclear, very little hydropower, and just a tiny, tiny bit of renewable energy. So this is where the real change has to happen. We have to find clean, renewable energy, because these kinds of emissions that are being generated at the power plants are exactly what's heating the air that's making climate change. Now, no talk about green IT can be complete unless you know one of the most horrifying statistics of all, that it takes 2.5 gallons of water to produce one sheet of paper. Now, I think in the UK they call it A4. It's roughly an 8.5 by 11-inch piece of paper that's represented by this slide. It takes 2.5 gallons of water to produce one sheet of paper. So if you can start to understand that this addiction to paper has to change, there's no reason we can't use post-consumer waste in recycled paper. I've been using 100% post-consumer waste recycled paper for a couple of years now, and I have no complaint. It just is fine. And then I recycle it again. In an organization with lots of distributed printers, eliminate them. Get them out to someone who has no computer, no printer. You know, don't throw them in the trash, but centralize your printing, because otherwise you're powering machines that are used just a little fraction of the time, but they're plugged in all the time. And duplex printing means you can print on both sides. So when you go to replace your printers, make sure that if you're buying new, that you're ordering a duplex printer, because then you can get use out of both sides of your pages. I know that this is a theme throughout Green IT awareness. We all know that we have to power things down. This stat that says that developed nations are using 5 to 10% of their residential power in vampire usage, that is, the usage of things that aren't being used. Vampire power is sucking energy at a 1% of global emissions rate, which is, you know, how simple is that? Turn it off. So back to the beginning, I want people to really think about pressuring manufacturers to take back, refurbish, and redeploy. Use recycling as the last result. Now, if you don't know the term cradle to cradle, this is a core sustainability concept. It means really to design with the end in mind so that we aren't creating waste. We're actually designing with take back in mind, and products can be the end product can be used again and again to create a huge increase in efficiency in terms of resource use. I say make your sustainability education a priority and ongoing. I don't believe there is such thing as anybody who knows everything in sustainability. If you are, you haven't woken up yet this morning. So I know that for myself, I made a change from IT as my focus to sustainability as my focus. And I feel like since that time I've been drinking from a fire hose. I'm sure you have things that you could add to my presentation, and I'd love to hear from you. So tell me what I missed. Tell me what you think I did wrong. And let's push this movement forward. Connect the dots. Make your choices count. And make IT last. I'd love to connect with you online. I'd love it if you'd read my blog. Redemtech produces a news bureau which is free. We have something on e-waste. We have something on regulations. We have stuff on data security. And I'd like to make all those resources available to you. And Tim, I think that's it.
Great. Thanks so much, Carol, for that really wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. I think you introduced a lot of really interesting and quite shocking and appalling, really, impacts of our obsession and use of IT in our day-to-day lives. We do generally tend to not consider the end-of-life impacts, so I think you really summarized that very, very well. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome. If you were shocked, I succeeded.
Yeah, very much. And I've seen a lot of that information, and I've certainly encountered that in the past, but it never, the effect never diminishes for me. It's always quite a shocking piece of information to really have that. It's quite a confrontational image, and it's never easy to reconcile. So
no, I don't want it to become easy.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. That's exactly right. We need to find solutions. So we will now commence the Q&A portion of our live speaker session. So audience, if you do have any questions that you would like to ask Carol about her presentation, about her work, or her experiences in general in green IT and sustainable IT, then please do submit your questions now in the questions box in the webinar control panel on your screen. Carol will address each question in turn, and please do remember, if you would like to speak with Carol or a representative of the Foundation for IT Sustainability, please feel free to email Carol or us at info@fitz.org at any time following this session, and we're more than happy to assist your query following the conclusion of today's session. So now, as I mentioned, we will move into the Q&A portion of the segment, and we'll start addressing the user-submitted questions. The first question we have for you today, Carol, is how does a user actually know where their stuff ends up when they drop it off at their local tech shop or collection event?
It's a fabulous question. Well, you start to have to ask questions, and if the answer is anything other than an E-Steward certified recycler, you can know that it's not ending up in a good place. There's just too much evidence that this particular industry, the recycling industry, has been acting less than ethically for a very, very long time, and hence the importance of the eastward auditing of all the certified recyclers. So demand an eastward certified recycler, and it's an eastwards.org has a map, an interactive map. You can find the closest one to you, but ask where the things are going, and really understand where they're going. Don't take, oh, they're going to a good cause as the end of the sentence.
Great. Thanks so much, Carol. The next question we have is, what should consumers look for when they're purchasing new IT infrastructure to reduce their environmental impact?
Well, that's a tough one because we haven't really done much in the way of looking at what's going into them so much. We are looking at EPEAT standards and Energy Star standards. So these two organizations are, EPEAT is looking at what's going in and trying to make things less toxic. NSTAR is going to be looking at the energy efficiency, which I didn't mean to downplay. So I did mean to downplay, but don't mean to think it's irrelevant. You know, you do, if in purchasing, you can make decisions about what equipment is more energy efficient. That should be part of your purchase decision.
Thanks so much, Carol. The next question I have is, do your recommendations vary from geography to geography?
I've lost you, Tim.
Can you hear me?
I've lost you. Could you repeat? No, you went off. You went. I heard do your recommendations, and then you went silent.
I see. No worries. Yeah, I'm happy. I'll repeat the question for you if you like. The question was, do your recommendations vary from geography to geography?
They do indeed, because I think, you know, unfortunately I feel less up to speed on Australia than anywhere in the world. And I'm in the U.S., so I'm trying to hold my fellow citizens accountable. But because legislation varies from geography to geography, my recommendations vary. In essence, I stick by the core recommendations. I just think they're more easily achieved in certain geographies. With the WE legislation in Europe, you know, there is a demand for take-back, and those things help a lot. In the United States, we have local legislations, we have state legislations, we have regional legislations, but very little in terms of actual federal regulation. So it's really incumbent on you in your own geography to know both the regulation and what you can do to further that regulation. We have a bill in Congress right now that is asking to ban the export of non-functioning equipment. There are human health issues at stake, there are environmental issues at stake, there are resource issues at stake, and it could become a jobs promotion bill. But with the current administration, I mean in Congress, the current Republican hold on the Congress, that bill is having a hard time getting out of committee. So yes, it is geography by geography, but the principles are the same. You know, you want to know where it's going. You don't want it to go in the trash no matter where you live.
Okay, thank you, Carol. The next question is, why do some countries do better than others when it comes to e-waste disposal? Is it purely legislation, or is there something else going on?
Boy, that's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer. I think it's not just legislation, and legislation is also not enough. I think, you know, I don't really know how to tell you other than I know that legislation is helping. And I do think this whole concept of sustainability is a matter of education. And if people can start to put sustainability education into mainstream education from a young age, I think we'll see a cultural change over time. another piece is what's the infrastructure available for handling the e-waste. So if manufacturers or retailers aren't required to take it back, what mechanisms exist for the take back? And that, I think, varies from geography to geography as well. But I'm open to, I really would like to learn more about this, so there may be folks out there that know more about this, and I would love to connect with you and have a further discussion. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Carol. No worries. The next question we have is, what is your perspective on leasing, of organizations leasing IT equipment to help reduce their overall impact, as opposed to purchasing new?
Well, first of all, I don't believe it reduces their overall environmental impact. It may reduce their financial impact. You know, a piece of leased equipment still has to be processed, and it has to be processed from a data security perspective as well as an environmental perspective. And who is your leasing partner, and what do they do with it? So I don't believe that leasing actually changes the equation. It just shifts the operators. If you disagree, please let me know. Explain it to me.
Thanks, Carol. The next question is more about the end of life and disposal of e-waste. So how do you recommend users find ethical e-waste disposal contractors in their local community?
I would start with the eStewards.org map. And, you know, there are ways to which I think we're going to have to start somewhat of a grassroots movement. We can pressure places like Best Buy and Staples, you know, to be sure that they're doing the right thing, because those become really good points of drop-off for consumers. I think consumers right now have very few choices. If you're in an organization, then it becomes a little bit easier, because that organization, ironically, has to be responsible for those assets first and foremost from a data security perspective. So we'll see that environmental risk and data security risk go hand in hand. You know, I've got other slides I didn't share with you, but they show asset tags from equipment that's very visible with the name of the originator on the asset tag. You know, in China, you'll see those. In Ghana, there on the open market, there are discs for sale, and one was purchased several years ago for $25. It was from the U.S. corporation Northrop Grumman. It had Department of Defense contracts readable and intact. So organizations have to pay attention to their asset security, their data security, their environmental liability. They can be dealt with all as one. If you're doing the right thing with your electronic waste, then you actually know that your data is secure. You know that you're not trashing the environment. You know, the organization. So a bigger organization should be really careful about its IT assets, and the bigger the organization, and sometimes the easier, because then, you know, you can find a partner that can help you get proceeds back from selling your equipment. Warrant your data destruction, make sure that you have no liability either from a data security side or an environmental side. There is no such thing as an organization that doesn't have data liability, not such a thing, whether it's a school which has, you know, employees which have personal data, including Social Security numbers and payroll information and student health information. No matter if it's a nonprofit, you know, there is sensitive data in every organization. So if you take those two things, the responsibility about the data and the responsibility about the environment and the asset itself as one big whole problem, then you can solve them all very ethically and efficiently.
Thanks so much, Carol. The next question is more around policy development. So what advice would you give an organization considering developing and implementing an e-waste policy?
Okay. So I'd say you'd want to start with identifying an eStewards recycler, because that recycler can help you with policy. Part of the problem has to do, you know, with what you've got stashed in closets, and you can start with getting rid of what you aren't using, and that's often a place where security policy falls down, because things that aren't being used aren't really under the network protection. They're not visible in the organization anymore. So you want to clean out those closets and get rid of things ethically. Eventually what you want is sort of an end-to-end process so that your asset management, you're tracking that asset from purchase all the way through e-waste, so that you're buying with the end in mind. You know where it's going to go at end of life. You want to make sure that no data-bearing asset leaves your organization without knowing that the data will be destroyed. Now, some things that people don't necessarily think about, you may have seen an article recently that cell phones ended up being sold in Africa, complete with pictures and address books from the previous owner. Cell phones, smartphones all have data. Computers obviously have data, but fax machines, copy equipment, scanners, these things are keeping a history of the things that they're scanning, the things that they're copying, and if you don't erase that memory, you have a huge security risk as well. So data security and environmental security need to go hand in hand when you're putting together your e-waste strategy.
Thank you, Carol. I'd love to hear your thoughts about Apple and Foxconn, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on those.
Well, the first thing I want you to know is that Foxconn, if people don't know, there's a big emphasis on what the state of working conditions in the manufacturer of Foxconn, which manufactures Apple equipment. What most people don't recognize is that Foxconn manufactures almost all electronic equipment. It's the same provider, whether it's your PC or your Android phone. 99% of the manufacturers are using Foxconn. So the fact that that Apple got the slap on the face with this is twofold. I mean, it is bad working conditions, and we should be absolutely doing something about the working conditions. Now, we've shown that part of the reports were fraudulent. They were not substantiated. So, bad for the people who created those original reports. The fact that the working conditions have been brought to our attention, I think, is really critical, and it goes back to how can we continue to simply consume without an understanding of who's at the end, who's actually making these products. And I believe that if what it means is an increase in price on device to make working conditions humane for workers who are creating these devices, then I think that's a wonderful thing, because it's this artificially low price point that is driving the rapid adoption and demand. And if we were paying more for these devices, we would be turning them over less frequently. So if we can, in fact, improve working conditions at a higher price, I actually think that that is a good thing. Part of our problem is predicated on the availability of cheap. And cheap is not cheap. It's just making somebody else pay.
Thanks so much, Carol. The next question we've received is, how should users choose between sending used computer equipment for reuse versus recycling?
My belief is that if it can be used, it should be used until it's no longer usable. And if you want to take this offline, I'm happy to talk to you about it, because at Redemtech, we will keep it out of the waste stream as long as possible. And then if it's not really refurbishable, then we'll harvest the parts and use those to repair other machines. And then, everything gets broken down, and recycling is not recycling has choices too. So you want to make sure that if the last result is recycling, that it's going to someplace that's going to reclaim the plastic, that's going to reclaim each and every component that's reclaimable. There's no reason trash should come out at the other end. But I think if there's usable life, there's somebody who needs that equipment.
A really good answer. I'm just going to post this to the audience now. If you do have any final questions for Carol, please do submit them now in the question box, and we'll have please use this resource we have available now. It's a great opportunity to get those niggling questions you've got around e-waste and the issues encountered in Carol's presentation. The next question we have, Carol, is, are you aware of any federal regulations regarding the safe disposal of old computers and other equipment from either a United States perspective or from other nations around the world?
I don't know the specifics of legislation in other parts of the world, though there certainly is. There are specifics around WEEE legislation in the EU. In the United States, there is no federal regulation. However, the General Services Administration has put out a mandate. Now, this mandate only applies to federal agencies of the United States. However, the federal government is one of the biggest computer holders, asset holders of electronic devices in the country, and it hopes, and it explicitly says that it hopes to act as a leadership for industry, but there is no federal e-waste law for the United States.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Carol. The next question we have, and I think it may be our last, is what are some of the behavior change tools and techniques that you could possibly recommend for our users in order to help them approach their organization and get as many people engaged in more sustainable IT behaviors in their office?
Well, you know, this first one, which I think everyone probably knows by heart but may not have thought about ways to implement it, is, you know, turn the computers off. And there are ways to help enforce that. There are things like power strips with timing devices that, you know, force the shutdown. I think education is critical. I see that with most organizations, even if they're not receptive to a sustainability message, they're very receptive to an economic message. So you can quickly draw a savings, you know, a financial savings for good green IT behaviors. So I don't think there's anything that I would recommend from a green IT perspective that isn't also a very good choice for an efficient organization financially. So if that means that that's how you can get the ear of your senior leadership, that's one place you should go. I also encourage you to involve senior leadership, because when the mandate comes from above, it has very different weight. And if you're having difficulty with that particular conversation and you want my help, I'm happy to help. I'll send a copy of my book to your CEO, COO, CIO, and set up a call. But I think everyone can take a next step. And if you can't figure out what that is, give me a shout and let's talk about what your next step could be.
Thank you, Carol. We actually have one final question submitted from our audience, and it is, how is the recent explosion and interest in cloud computing affecting e-waste?
Well, again, I think it's one of those pieces. I feel like there's a magic, you know, a sleight of hand. If you move your equipment out of your office, does it mean that it's not generating, you know, it's not consuming energy? I think not. I think you'll find someone here. So I've been working with computers since 1971. And I look with skepticism at the cloud for many reasons. One of which is that I don't think that people really understand the vulnerability of it. In these 20 years since the Internet for Dummies first came out, and people went from not knowing what the Internet was to being born connected to devices, we don't have the understanding of how this is actually working and deployed. We don't understand the risks that have been put in place. Now, literally every aspect of contemporary society in the United States, and I know a lot of parts of the world, is completely electronically driven, whether it's traffic lights, whether it's fuel deployment. All of these things are now dependent upon electricity, and that to me, creates a huge vulnerability. It particularly creates a vulnerability when we have resource contention. We have an energy crisis. The energy crisis is not separate from the water crisis. And as there are now 7 billion people on the planet and we think they should all be connected, are we really understanding what that means in terms of what it means to power everything? Now you think I've gone off the deep end, but when your question was about cloud, but it is not, they are all connected. And if we don't understand that we're consuming electricity, even if it's in the cloud, that this always on state in the cloud is simply taking the problem from in front of us to putting it out there somewhere we're not so cognizant of, I don't think it's really solving a sustainability problem. I think it's a proliferating one.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Carol. Well, I think that was the last question we had for Carol tonight, so that will end our webinar session for this evening. I just wanted to say a big thank you to our speaker, Carol, particularly for your time and your willingness to share your information and experience with us. It's been a fantastic presentation session. I've learned a lot personally, and I'm sure the audience will learn a lot as well. So thank you very much for that.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, and I hope to hear from you all.
Thanks, Carol. I also just want to say a big thanks to everyone who's participated in tonight's session and those who have come along, and those who are watching us following the event from our uploaded podcast. So we're glad you could all join us, and we certainly hope the session was helpful for you. Just a reminder that a recording of this session will be made available within 24 hours via the Green IT registration page for Carol. So if you had any closing remarks or comments, Carol?
I just think this is a fabulous forum, and I'm hoping that this isn't the end of our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. We really do appreciate it. So that does conclude our session for this evening, or this morning, depending on where you are. So thank you again, and please do enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everyone.